Can a system built to protect Western power turn against it? It just did. The United Nations, created in 1945 to lock in the dominance of World War II's winners, has openly sided with Africa. Not with vague gestures or empty resolutions, but by amplifying the call of one of Africa's fiercest voices, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré. For decades, Africa has been stripped of resources, ignored in leadership, and shut out of the real decisions. Now the very institution that froze power in Western hands for nearly 80 years has said, Africa deserves more power, more representation, and a permanent seat at the top table. When UN Secretary-General António Guterres stood before the Security Council, he didn't hide behind diplomacy. He called the council outdated, unbalanced, and unjust to Africa, words that shattered the room. This wasn't policy talk. It was a direct hit on the legitimacy of the post-World War II world order. For Washington, and for leaders like Donald Trump who see the UN as irrelevant, it was a jolt. For Africa, it was the loudest confirmation yet that the old rules are cracking. The UN's top official just said what the West has avoided for decades. Africa, 1.4 billion people, 50-plus nations, the youngest population on Earth, home to the fastest-growing economies and the most UN peacekeeping missions, has 0 permanent seats on the Security Council. António Guterres didn't stop there. He blasted the council as a relic of a post-war world that no longer exists and demanded Africa not only get a permanent seat, but also greater control in the IMF and World Bank, the very institutions that shape African economies. This wasn't charity. It was a question of legitimacy. The world cannot claim peace, security, or prosperity without African leadership at the table, he said. For the US, France, and the UK, this was a gut punch. For decades, they've kept Africa in powerless rotating seats while holding veto power themselves. Now the UN, once their shield, is calling for that imbalance to be broken. In just 2 years, Africa's political mood has shifted from polite diplomacy to open confrontation with the legacy of colonialism. At the center is one man, Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young president. Guterres never said his name, but the UN's bombshell statement lands squarely in Traoré's shadow. He has become the face of a new Pan-African defiance, expelling French troops, rejecting foreign mining control, and calling for African nations to reclaim their sovereignty. Traoré's bluntness has electrified millions, especially young Africans who see him as the antidote to the cautious leaders of the past. His speeches spread like wildfire across student movements and activist circles, not as nationalism, but as a long-overdue demand for dignity. It's in this charged climate that Africa's push for a permanent UN Security Council seat has caught fire. The UN may have spoken the words, but the momentum comes from the ground up, and from leaders like Traoré, who are forcing the global order to face a reality it has long ignored. The UN isn't just talking reform, it's siding with Africa at the exact moment leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are openly defying Western control. And for Donald Trump, it's a nightmare scenario. Trump has long called the UN useless, cut its funding, and pulled the US out of key agencies. But he never imagined it would take a stance that could blow a hole in the post-war system America dominates. Giving Africa a permanent Security Council seat would either dilute US power by expanding the council or force a redistribution of veto rights. Either way, America's supremacy takes a hit. What's worse for Washington? The UN is now taking cues from African leaders who are rejecting the West's military and economic grip. For the US foreign policy establishment, this isn't just about adding a seat. It's the first visible crack in the world order they've spent decades protecting. Trump's anger is just the surface. The real fear in the West is that the UN, once a loyal ally, is slipping out of its control. By endorsing Africa's demands, the UN has broken with decades of diplomatic choreography. This wasn't about lofty ideals. It was cold, undeniable math. Africa provides over 40% of UN peacekeepers, stabilizing conflicts from the Sahel to Lebanon and Haiti. Nearly half of all UN missions are on African soil. African soldiers risk their lives for global peace, yet their nations hold no permanent power over the decisions that send them into harm's way. Africa fuels the world, from rare earth minerals to food supplies, while bearing the brunt of debt, climate change, and foreign exploitation. And still, its voice has been kept outside the room where global power is decided. Guterres put it bluntly, without African peace, there is no global peace. Without African prosperity, there is no global prosperity. For decades, African leaders have said, nothing about us without us. Now, for the first time, the UN is saying it too. And that shakes the very foundations laid in 1945, when Africa, still in chains, was deliberately written out of the world order. When the UN handed out permanent Security Council seats after World War II, they went to the victors, the US, UK, France, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China. Africa got nothing. Even after independence, Africa was given only rotating seats, no veto, and no permanent voice. The system was locked, and Africa was locked out. For decades, African leaders demanded change. Since the 1990s, calls for a permanent seat echoed in the UN General Assembly, only to be buried under delays, political deals, and quiet resistance from those clinging to power. Now, for the first time, the UN's own top leadership is calling Africa's exclusion what it really is, a structural injustice that undermines the institution's credibility. The cracks in the 1945 order aren't just visible, they're widening. A blueprint is now on the table. Give Africa a permanent Security Council seat, overhaul the IMF and World Bank to give it real influence, and fix climate and development funding that favors the rich. Even partial adoption would mark one of the biggest shifts in global power since the UN's creation, exactly what leaders like Ibrahim Traoré have been demanding for years. Right now, all eyes are on Africa. But make no mistake, this is bigger than Africa. What's happening could be the death rattle of a 70-year-old world order. This isn't just about giving Africa a permanent seat at the table. It's about ripping up the seating chart entirely. If Africa gains real, institutional power, it will change how wars are ended, how peacekeeping missions are launched, and who decides when foreign boots land on someone else's soil. It will rewrite the rules of global aid. Who gets the loans, who sets the interest rates, and who dictates the fine print. And that's just the start. Imagine a world where African nations, sitting on vast reserves of gold, oil, cobalt, and rare earth minerals, can dictate their own terms in trade deals. Not as junior partners, but as equals with the power to say, take it or leave it. That alone would send shockwaves through the global economy. Add to that Africa's growing ties with China, Russia, and blocs like BRICS, and the picture is even clearer. The West's decades-long grip on global dominance is slipping. What's unfolding isn't some polite diplomatic shuffle. It's a geopolitical earthquake. For the West, it's the end of the monopoly. For Africa, it's the start of writing history on its own terms, no longer a passive recipient of global decisions, but a decisive maker of them. Now, the UN's recent declaration isn't a magic wand. Permanent reform doesn't happen overnight. Big institutions drag their feet. But here's the shocker. Even the UN, the same body designed to preserve the post-World War II power structure, is now openly admitting that structure is broken. That admission alone is a seismic political moment. For leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who have stared down foreign powers, demanded sovereignty, and paid the price in international backlash, this is vindication. His voice, once dismissed as defiant, now echoes through the halls of the UN as a signal that the global tide is turning. And for defenders of the old guard, from Donald Trump to entrenched Western diplomats, this is a warning shot. The assumptions that built the post-war era aren't just under threat. They are collapsing in real time. The only question left is the one that will define the century. Will the West double down to protect a system born in 1945? Or will it face the reality that Africa, young, resource-rich, and politically awake, is no longer knocking on the door of power, but standing in the doorway, ready to walk in? One thing is certain, the world has already changed, and there's no going back. So here's the real question. Can the UN, an institution built to cement Western power, actually back Africa's rise without tearing apart its own foundations? Is this the moment Africa finally shatters decades of political and economic marginalization? Tell us in the comments. Will the West accept Africa at the center of global power, or fight tooth and nail to stop it? If you want more videos on Black Africa, its history, power, culture, and the truths the world ignores, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.